Chelmsford County High School, which is a girls' grammar school in Essex, and I'm going to be talking about the verse literature selection from the Cambridge Latin Anthology for examination in 2023 and 24. The two passages are, well, the two themes are the passage of Echo and Narcissus, and then 3 poems which have been grouped under the title of Amor. Here is the text cycle for this 2-year period. As you can see, we have Echo and Narcissus, which is a chunk of Ovid Metamorphoses 3 with some editing in there, and then Catullus 7, Catullus 85, and a fragment of Propertius. First question, I suppose, might be, why would you opt for these texts as opposed to the Virgil option? And I think arguments can be made either way. We tend at our school to opt for the anthology choice just because it provides that breadth of authors and therefore exposes students to a greater number of texts and authors in their Latin studies, on the off chance that they don't continue to A-level. But equally, I can understand the argument that if a student is not going to be continuing to A-level, then one might want them to have encountered some Virgil in the original before they move on, before they finish their Latin studies. So arguments exist for both. Regarding the anthology, though, there is a slightly different approach in that with the Virgil, you are only going to be working through it chronologically, whereas with the anthology selection, you've got these 4 pieces which you could tackle in a variety of orders. There are a number of ways that you can approach that. Do you want to do all of the Catullus ones, or both of the Catullus ones first? Do you want to start with the Echo and Narcissus? And there are a few different rationales as to why you might tackle them in particular orders. Do you want to tackle them by length? It might be that you want to start with a short one. If so, you could start with a very short one. Odi et Amor, Catullus 85, would give students a great sense of accomplishment very early on, translating an entire poem in very, very short order. Or alternatively, again, you might want to start with the longest one, which would be the Echo and Narcissus, so that when you completed that, you've broken the back of it. You might want to select it by length in order to fit in with other deadlines and other timelines. For example, we tend to start our literature study towards the end of year 10. So in the summer term of year 10, normally just after Easter. And so we would pick a text that we are confident that we can complete before the summer break, so that we're not leaving something incomplete to pick up on after a 6-week break. But depending on your own timetable, it will be up to you whether that's something to be considering. You might also want to be picking what order you do them in, based on how it fits in with your assessment cycle. If you've got mocks coming up, then again, you might want to have completed a set of poems. So you might do all of the Amor ones, for example, so that you can then compose a mock paper which replicates the actual paper, but on a kind of self-contained selection of the poems. You might want to think about the interaction between the texts. And if you are doing the prose verse as well rather than the themes, then you might want to think about how you want to integrate those. Are you going to do all of the verse and all of the prose separately? Are you going to alternate? Again, it's entirely up to you, but these are all considerations that you might want to have before you start the teaching of this text. The context of the school is going to impact on both the things that we were just discussing and also on the approaches that you take to the delivery and assessment of the literature. Things like class size, things like time limitations, student ability, their years of Latin study, and the resources that are available to you. So If you have got a smaller class size, then you might be able to have a more kind of small seminar style discussion all as one group. If you've got a bigger class, you might need to add an extra layer in there with group work and then bringing people together to share their opinions. That will obviously take a little bit longer. Your time limitations based on whether you're how long you're spreading your Latin GCSE across, how many years of Latin study they have had previously, all of this will impact on how you structure the pace in which you need to cover the texts, and that will therefore dictate how you choose to cover the text. How strong is their English literature? That might impact on, again, how much support they require in their Latin literature study. If you're able to make really obvious links for students that are already doing very well in English literature, then that might be a kind of a shortcut that you'll be able to use for your Latin literature teaching. In terms of resources, do they have electronic devices? Will they be able to do sharing of online documents? Things along those lines. Obviously, coming out of remote teaching and blended learning, I say coming out of it, there's obviously the chance that we might still continue to be in it to a degree. These may well also impact on how you go about delivering and assessing this component of the Latin GCSE. In terms of the translation and analysis, I'm just going to talk about some of the things that we do at CCHS, and I would be very happy to discuss different strategies on the panel discussion on the 18th. We, controversially, I'm aware, do use a numbered translation, so I would just have that up on the whiteboard for those who do want to be using it, but there's no compulsion. All the students would be working in groups with just the Latin from the textbook in front of them, and the numbered translation is there as a suggestion for how they might want to go about ordering their translation. But I would always equally state that there's no correct translation, no one correct translation to these passages, and I think it's important as well to recognise that to a degree the translation of the material is merely a means to an end for engaging with what it means, how the author conveys the themes, the techniques that they use to convey those things. So in a manner, I would argue that we're just kind of getting through the translation as a means of accessing the richness of the text. I would also argue that the number translation, even if it's not used in the class by all of our students, is actually a useful aide-memoire when it comes to them revising this material, to reviewing the text and reminding themselves how they got to the translation that they did get to. So I think that's useful as well, though I absolutely can understand the arguments against the number translation approach. In terms of structuring the analysis, the slides that I've got on the right hand side here are actually a colleague's slides. The kind of top one, these are from last year's cycle. The top one is a more basic one, and so it's just a case of highlighting particular things that the students might want to comment on. Nothing would stop them commenting on any other aspect of the text, but that's to as a strategy to support those students who feel less confident in the literary analysis portion. The kind of busier document on the bottom right is really a product of delivering the literature during the remote learning cycle, and the blended learning cycle as well, where we would highlight particular techniques that we might want students to comment on with some prompt questions, and then we would record those answers on the same slide, which is really useful for any students who are unable to join a live lesson, for example, if they were not able to partake in so it mitigated asynchronous learning. Also those who had just had laggy tech and were struggling therefore to note down any of the commentary that was coming up from the teacher or their peers during a live streamed lesson. This was an opportunity for them to catch up on anything that they might have missed later. Once more, I'd be really excited to discuss other strategies that people have in place for both the translation and the analysis on the 18th. Another question to consider is how much background the students will require in order to engage with the texts. How much context will they need? How much will they need to know about the author? How much do they need to know about genre conventions and the like? And I think for this year's cycle of the verse, it will vary slightly depending on each passage. For the Ovid and the Petronius, I wouldn't have said that a huge biographical or historical context is probably required, and in the case of the Petronius would be quite challenging anyway. For Ovid, you'd probably want to provide some context on Echo and how she comes to feature in the myth, because we do enter the narrative with her already having been cursed to be repeating words, but it's not expressed why. So we might want to either explain that, or perhaps this would be an opportunity to include a translation passage to explain how she comes to be in this situation. Although I must confess I had a little dig and I couldn't find one myself, so if anyone has got one and wants to share it with us on the 18th, that would be fabulous. For Ovid as well, you may choose to go into some of the, or indeed for the Catullus as well, you might want to discuss some of the artistic representations, the impact that they both had in terms of their on visual art. For the Catullus as well, I think that it would be worthwhile to provide a little bit of context on the turbulent relationship between him and Lesbia, which will then feed into the discussion of the Odi et Amo poem and the How Many Kisses. And that would give you a bit of a way into describing the very different tones of those two poems, perhaps. I've also noted on this slide that Narcissus in particular seems to be quite ripe for classically themed memes, so you might want to include some of those as well. In terms of the resources that are available to us, resources that we end up providing to our students are a translation. Once more, I make it clear that it's not the translation, but it's a translation, which is useful for anyone who's missed a lesson, who just struggles with organisation and keeping their notes in order, or indeed, in the current situation, anyone who has missed anything through remote or blended learning. We also then provide them with an annotated notes section, which is then which is there kind of as a crutch, but also as a supplement, I suppose, because there will be some overlap, but they will not be identical to the notes that we have made in class, because we're very much trying to draw the students' own ideas out in the class, whereas the notes that we've made on this Word document here are the ones that we as staff have come up with. In terms of resources for teachers, we've got the Teacher's Handbook, which is of some use. We've also got the Cambridge Latin Anthology website, which if you have access to technology during your lessons could be really useful, or indeed for homework if you want the students preparing any translations at home, because it's got the vocabulary and grammar that you can click through on the text, which is wonderful. And it also has the function where it will record any words that you have clicked on and then generate a personalized vocabulary test, which could be really handy as a revision strategy for your students as well. So that's always useful to refer to and to share with the students. There's also the zigzag packs that you are probably familiar with. They start at about 50 quid, I think, for the basic package, and then it increases if you want a sharing site license and an editable one. Again, we use those to refer to, we're not led by them, but they're useful just to refer to every so often. We don't tend to share those with the students, but if you've got the site license, then that's absolutely fine to do so. Once more, if anyone's got any other resources they'd like to share with us, that would be great to hear from on the panel day on the 18th. In terms of the assessment, here is the overview of each of the literature papers. So you'll have 5 marks of translation, 4 marks of analysis, and this question is supported with an English translation. You've then got your 8 mark stylistic analysis extended answer and your 10 mark summative content based extended answer. I'll be exploring both of those in a bit more detail down the line, and then that leaves 23 marks of guided literary criticism. It could again be a 4 or 6 mark question where they're instructed to make 2 or 3 points. Some contextual comprehension, what's happened previously, who is this person, what does this noun refer to, or word identification. It could be identify the adjective describing Narcissus on this line, something along those lines. Identify and translate for 2 marks. So you'll have a combination of those kinds of things to make up the 23 marks, giving you 50 marks for the entire paper on a 60-minute paper. Therefore, we tend to guide our students that if they work at about a mark a minute, then that's going to give them plenty of time at the end to be checking their work, and also they can work on the assumption that they're probably going to be earning themselves time, because if they've learned their translation thoroughly, then the 5 mark translation shouldn't take them 5 minutes to jot down, and that will then give them extra time to be devoting to the 8 mark and the 10 mark questions. So they can get away with spending 10-12 minutes on the 8 mark question and maybe 15 minutes on the 10 mark question, just in order to get as much down on those 2 questions as possible. Looking then at the 8 markers, this is again a slide from the previous cycle of instructions guidance that I give to our students, and an example question that we provided to them. So the bullet points here, we guide our students to aim for 6 to 8 weighty points. The exam board won't be tied down on how many points precisely. We've only got the marking grid to be led by, but my understanding is that if we go for 6 to 8 decent weighty points, then that will be enough to allow you to access those highest grades, those highest marks for this component. The students should be instructed to be guided by the space that's given to them on the paper, and if they work at just over a mark a minute, so 10 minutes for an 8 mark question should be about appropriate. I think it's important to use quite specific terminology here. So I try to avoid, as much as the students will lazily default to this, I try to avoid referring to this question and the 10 marker as essays, because they're not essays like they will be doing in other subjects. There's no need for an introduction or a conclusion. Their paragraphs, particularly on the 8 markers, are going to be perhaps much shorter than they would want to be doing in an English literature essay, and there's not necessarily going to be the same level of flow and therefore conjunctions and joining sentences at the start and end of paragraphs as they might be expected to produce in an English literature essay. They could almost be writing a list of bullet pointed lists of bullet points here, and then just kind of removing the bullet points to give them their paragraphs. Having said that, I would try to make links where possible with the essay approaches that they are using in English literature and in the humanities. So maybe PQA, point quote analysis, or PEE, point evidence explanation, and try to map that onto the approach that you would like them to be using for the Latin. So I would say that the PQA, therefore, for Latin would be the point is the technique that they're making, the technique that they're identifying, whether that is a stylistic technique, such as repetition, the emphatic position of a word, chiasmus, hendiades, something along those lines, or whether it's just a vocabulary choice. That can absolutely be a point. The quotation is the word or phrase in the Latin and the English, so they're making it absolutely clear what they're referring to, both in the Latin and the English. And then the analysis or the explanation, depending on whether they're going PQA or PEE, would then be linking that back to the question. I then try to get them to guide them that they don't want it to sound too repetitive, but they need to be making it clear that they are answering the question in front of them and not just regurgitating a list of points that they know, with no regard to the question that's actually being asked. So most of their points for the question that I'd presented with them would be some variation of, and this makes Medea more sympathetic. But yeah, getting them to try to vary that a little bit so it doesn't sound quite so repetitive. But that's the basic attempt. So that's the guidance that we would provide for tackling these 8-mark questions. The 10 markers are, again, I think it's worth reminding the students not an essay, so there's no need here for an extended introduction or conclusion, even though the questions here are perhaps more lean more towards a conclusion. I think it's important not to remind the students not to waste loads of time on a very lengthy introduction or conclusion, because it's not that aspect of the content that's going to be gaining them lots of marks, or indeed losing them lots of marks if it's not there. I would argue that in some ways this is potentially less challenging despite its higher tariff, despite it being 10 marks rather than 8, and I think the previous GCSE spec perhaps recognised that. However, in the current situation, I think it's absolutely therefore worth stressing to students that this is a way for them to be accessing really high marks on this paper, because there's no need to be quoting Latin. It is purely content based. The key here really is coverage. So once again, earning time earlier in the paper to devote to this question could be really, really useful, and making sure that they read the question really thoroughly to ensure that they're addressing all of the text or texts that they are being advised to tackle. I've put on here the verse literature A, so that was the last text cycle using an anthology. It happened to be the Oxford anthology, the OCR anthology rather than the Cambridge anthology, but I thought this was the closest to the Cambridge anthology because there we've got examples of questions referring to multiple authors and texts. So those are the 3 that were presented as part of the question packs prior to the tags generation last term, and from that I've tried to come up with some possible questions that might relate to these texts in this cycle. I would advise, what I do with my students is try to get the students to look at a large text or a group of texts and see if they can identify any linking themes, any overarching themes, and then see if they can generate questions from that. And that's what I've tried to do here. If it's a question on one text, I think it's in this cycle is only likely to be on the Echo and Narcissus. Otherwise, it's going to be on multiple texts, either all of the Amor poems or all of the Amor poems and Echo or Narcissus. And the 2 questions that I've posed here, I think could either apply to just Echo and Narcissus, or just the Amor poems, or all of the verse poems from this cycle. So I've gone for love is portrayed as a negative emotion. Do you agree? Or to what extent do you agree? If it was a to what extent, you might expect something like love is portrayed as a wholly negative emotion, perhaps, so that you can give that kind of yes but, no but answer. How do the authors highlight the power of love in these texts? My only hope would be that we don't get some lazy question along the lines of, what aspects of these poems did you find interesting? Because I think it's really difficult to answer as a question for the students, and I don't think it allows them to show off the fullness of their knowledge either. So again, I'd be really, really interested on the 18th to discuss 10 markers on this aspect of the GCSE literature. And so I look forward to discussing this and answering any questions that may well have come up from viewing this video. Thanks ever so much.